The bus rattled along the uneven road, its engine groaning as we wound our way toward the Andes. I pressed my forehead against the dusty window, watching jagged peaks rise against the horizon like the edges of a broken promise. After the divorce, my life had unraveled into a series of gray days. Work, sleep, repeat, each one draining me further until I felt like a husk. I'd signed up for this women's climbing group on a whim, desperate for something to jolt me awake, to remind me I could still feel. The mountains, I thought, might force me to confront the emptiness I'd been carrying. I wasn't sure if I was running from my past or toward something new, but I needed to find out. There were 8 of us in the group, women of different ages, each with her own reasons for being here. Some chatted eagerly about the climb, their voices bright with anticipation, while others, like me, stayed quiet, lost in our thoughts. I hugged my rucksack to my chest, its weight a small comfort against the uncertainty gnawing at me. My eyes kept drifting to the back of the bus, where she sat, alone, staring at the floor. She was younger, maybe in her early 30s, with dark hair spilling out from under a faded bandana. There was something about her stillness that felt familiar, like she was carrying a weight she didn't want to share. The bus lurched to a stop at the trailhead, and the air grew thick with the scent of pine and dust. Our guide, a wiry woman with a no-nonsense attitude, barked instructions about the route ahead. I tried to focus, but my attention wandered back to her, the woman at the back. She moved with a quiet purpose as we disembarked, her eyes scanning the ground like she was reading a story in the dirt. I wondered what she was looking for, or maybe what she was avoiding. Her presence tugged at something deep inside me, something I couldn't name yet. We lined up in a loose formation, ready to begin the ascent. The guide's voice faded into the background as I adjusted my pack, feeling the straps dig into my shoulders. The trail stretched out before us, narrow and unforgiving, disappearing into the shadow of the mountains. I stole a glance at her as we started walking. She took her place at the end of the line, her steps deliberate, almost reverent. I wondered if she felt the same pull I did, the need to prove something, to herself or to the world. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of the wilderness. My boots crunched against the rocky path, each step a small rebellion against the life I'd left behind. I didn't know what I was chasing up here, but I knew I couldn't stay where I'd been. The divorce had stripped me of illusions, leaving me raw and searching. Work had been a relentless grind, each deadline a reminder of how little I had left to give. This climb was my chance to feel something else, even if it was just the ache in my legs or the burn in my lungs. She stayed at the back, her silhouette a constant in my peripheral vision. I didn't know why I kept noticing her, why my eyes sought her out when I should have been focused on the trail. Maybe it was the way she moved, like she belonged here, like the mountains were an extension of her. Or maybe it was the way her silence mirrored my own, a shared language of things left unsaid. I shook my head, trying to focus on the path ahead. This wasn't about her. It was about me, about finding a way to breathe again. The group spread out as we climbed, the stronger hikers pulling ahead while others lagged. I found a rhythm, my breath syncing with my steps, though my mind refused to settle. I thought about the life I'd left behind, the empty apartment, the unanswered emails, the weight of expectations I'd never met. Up here, none of that mattered, yet it followed me like a shadow. I glanced back again, catching her eye for a fleeting moment. She didn't smile, but there was something in her gaze that made my chest tighten, like she saw through me. The trail grew steeper, and my legs burned with the effort. I wasn't an experienced climber, and every step reminded me of that. The guide called for a brief rest, and I dropped onto a flat rock, my breath coming in short gasps. She lingered nearby, adjusting the straps of her pack with practiced ease. I wanted to say something, to break the silence between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched her, wondering what had brought her here, what ghosts she was carrying. The mountains loomed above us, their peaks sharp against the sky. I felt small beneath them, but not insignificant, not yet. This was only the beginning, and already I could feel the pull of something new, something alive. I didn't know what it was, but it had to do with her, with the way her presence stirred something in me I thought I'd lost. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. This climb wasn't just about reaching the summit. It was about finding something I didn't even know I was looking for. The trail wound upward, a narrow ribbon of dirt and stone cutting through the rugged landscape of the Andes. My boots slipped occasionally on loose gravel, and I focused on placing one foot in front of the other, trying to ignore the growing ache in my thighs. The air already felt thinner, each breath a conscious effort that reminded me how far I was from the suffocating routine of my old life. I'd come here to escape the monotony, the endless meetings, the hollow ache of a failed marriage. But as I climbed, I realized I wasn't just running from something. I was chasing a feeling, something to prove I wasn't as broken as I felt. The group moved in a loose line, our footsteps a quiet rhythm against the hum of the wind. The other women chatted sporadically, their voices carrying stories of past hikes or reasons for joining this one. I stayed silent, my thoughts too tangled to share. My eyes kept drifting to her, the woman at the back, her pace steady but unhurried, like she was measuring each step against some private memory. Her dark hair swayed slightly under her bandana, and I wondered what kept her so distant, so guarded. There was a weight to her movements, a story she wasn't telling. We stopped for a break at a small clearing, the mountains stretching endlessly around us. I sat on a smooth boulder, gulping water from my flask, the cold liquid a sharp relief against my dry throat. She settled a few feet away, her rucksack beside her like an old friend. I noticed her hands, calloused, strong, the kind that had gripped ropes and rocks for years. Her fingers moved with quiet precision as she adjusted her gear, and I found myself staring, wondering about the life those hands had lived. When she glanced up, catching my gaze, I felt a flush creep up my neck and quickly looked away. The guide called us back to the trail, her voice cutting through the murmur of the group. I stood, brushing dirt from my pants, and fell into step behind the others. The path grew steeper, and my lungs burned with the effort of pulling in the thinning air. I wasn't used to this, the altitude, the strain, the rawness of being so exposed to the elements. Yet there was something exhilarating about it, like the mountains were peeling back layers I'd forgotten I had. I glanced back, and she was still there, last in line, her eyes fixed on the ground as if reading its secrets. I stumbled over a root, catching myself just before I fell. My heart raced, not just from the near miss, but from the sudden awareness of her behind me. She didn't say anything, but I felt her presence, steady and unshakable, like the rocks beneath our feet. I wondered if she'd noticed my clumsiness, if she was judging me for it. The thought made me self-conscious, but it also made me want to prove I could keep up, that I wasn't as out of place as I felt. I straightened my shoulders and pushed forward, determined to match her quiet strength. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the trail. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I wiped it away with the back of my hand, feeling the grit of dust against my skin. The group spread out, the faster climbers pulling ahead while I stayed in the middle, neither leading nor trailing. I could still feel her behind me, a constant in the shifting rhythm of the hike. It was strange, this awareness of her, like a thread pulling me backward, even as I moved forward. I didn't understand it, but I didn't want it to stop. At the next rest stop, I dropped onto a rock, my legs trembling from the effort. She sat nearby, her flask in hand, her eyes scanning the horizon. I wanted to talk to her, to ask why she was here, what she was carrying that made her so quiet. But the words felt too heavy, too intrusive. Instead, I watched her sip her water, the way her throat moved, the way her fingers curled around the flask. There was something intimate in that moment, something I couldn't explain, and it made my chest ache with a longing I hadn't felt in years. The guide's voice broke the spell, calling us to move on. I stood, my body protesting, and glanced at her one last time before turning back to the trail. She met my eyes, and for a moment, it felt like she saw me, not the exhausted woman dragging herself up a mountain, but someone else, someone I was still trying to find. I turned away, my heart pounding, and started walking again. The mountains loomed ahead, vast and unyielding, but it was her presence that made me feel like I was on the edge of something new. I didn't know what I was looking for when I signed up for this climb, but I was starting to think it wasn't just about the summit. The trail stretched on, each step pulling me further from the life I'd known and closer to something I couldn't yet name. Her shadow followed me, quiet but undeniable, and I let myself wonder what it would be like to know her, to share the silence that seemed to bind us. The mountains were teaching me something already, not about strength, but about the courage to feel again. I took a deep breath and kept climbing, aware of her every step behind me. The sun dipped below the peaks, leaving the sky a deep indigo as we set up camp on a rocky plateau. The cold settled in quickly, seeping through my jacket and into my bones, making every movement feel heavier. We pitched our tents in a tight cluster, the wind whistling through the gaps between the rocks. I helped hammer stakes into the hard ground, my hands stiff and clumsy in the evening chill. The group buzzed with quiet energy. Some women laughed, others unpacked gear, but I felt detached, like I was watching it all through a fog. This place, so raw and vast, made my old life feel like a distant dream. I sat by the fire, the flames crackling as they devoured the dry wood we'd gathered. The warmth was a small comfort against the biting air, and I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders. The other women shared stories, tales of past adventures, of kids left at home, of reasons for climbing. I listened without joining in, my thoughts too heavy to form into words. My divorce had left me hollow, and work had filled the void with endless demands, each one chipping away at what little I had left. I didn't have a story worth telling, not yet. She sat across the fire, her face half lit by the flickering glow. The light danced in her eyes, softening the sharp edges of her expression, but there was still that weight, that unspoken burden she carried. I watched her hands, curled around a tin mug, the steam rising in thin wisps. Her fingers were steady, but there was a tension in them, like she was holding on to something more than just the mug. I wondered what she was thinking. What kept her so separate from the rest of us? Her silence felt like a mirror to my own, reflecting back the parts of me I'd tried to ignore. The guide mentioned tomorrow's route, a tougher stretch with steeper climbs. I noticed her shoulders stiffen, her gaze dropping to the fire, as if the words had stirred something deep. I wanted to ask her about it, but the thought felt intrusive, like stepping into a space I hadn't been invited to. Instead, I sipped my own tea, the bitter warmth grounding me. The firelight played across her face, and I caught myself staring at the curve of her jaw, the way her lips pressed together in thought. My stomach twisted, a mix of curiosity and something else I wasn't ready to name. As the group began to drift to their tents, I stayed by the fire, reluctant to face the cold solitude of my sleeping bag. She lingered too, poking at the embers with a stick, sending sparks into the air. The silence between us was heavy but not uncomfortable, like we were both waiting for something to shift. I shifted my weight, the rock beneath me cold through my pants. My mind wandered to the life I'd left behind, the empty apartment, the unanswered messages, the weight of a marriage that had crumbled under its own expectations. Up here, those things felt far away, but they still clung to me like dust I couldn't shake. Finally, I spoke, my voice quieter than I intended. "You've been here before, haven't you?" I asked, my eyes on the fire to avoid her gaze. She didn't answer right away, and for a moment I thought she hadn't heard me. Then she nodded, her voice low and rough when she spoke. "3 years ago," she said, and there was a crack in her words, a fracture that hinted at something broken. I wanted to ask more, to know what had happened, but the pain in her voice stopped me. She stood, brushing ash from her hands, and headed toward her tent. I watched her go, the firelight casting her shadow long and lean against the rocks. My chest ached, not from the cold or the altitude, but from the way her words lingered, heavy and unfinished. I stayed by the fire a little longer, the flames dying down to glowing coals. The stars above were sharp and countless, a reminder of how small I was, how vast this world could be. But it wasn't the mountains that kept me awake that night. It was her, and the way her presence made me feel seen. Sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside my tent, and the cold pressed against the thin fabric, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept seeing her face in the firelight, the way her eyes held a story she wasn't ready to tell. I thought about her hands, the calluses that spoke of years spent ripping ropes, and I wondered what it would feel like to have those hands touch me. The thought startled me, sending a flush of heat through my body despite the chill. I buried it deep, telling myself it was just the isolation, the altitude, the strangeness of this place. When I finally closed my eyes, her image followed me into my dreams. I saw her standing against the mountains, her silhouette sharp against the sky, her gaze pulling me closer. There was something magnetic about her, something that made me want to know her, to understand the pain she carried. I didn't know what this feeling was, but it was alive, pulsing in my chest like a second heartbeat. The mountains were supposed to be my escape, but they were starting to feel like a bridge. To what? I wasn't sure. The trail grew merciless as we pushed higher, the path narrowing into a series of sharp switchbacks that clung to the mountainside. My legs burned with each step, the muscles protesting against the relentless incline. The air was thinner now, and I had to pause often, my chest heaving as I gulped down shallow breaths. I wasn't prepared for this kind of exertion, not really, but I refused to fall behind. The divorce had left me questioning my strength, and work had convinced me I had none left. Up here, every step felt like a small act of defiance against that doubt. She stayed at the back, as always, her presence a quiet constant behind me. I could feel her watching, not in a judgmental way, but with a steady awareness that made my skin prickle. When I stumbled on a loose rock, her hand shot out, catching my elbow with a grip that was firm yet gentle. "Careful," she said, her voice low and steady, close enough that I felt her breath against my ear. I nodded, my heart racing from more than just the stumble, and her touch lingered on my skin long after she let go. It was a fleeting moment, but it stirred something in me, something warm and unfamiliar. We stopped at a narrow ledge for a break, the wind cutting through my jacket as I leaned against a boulder. The guide was explaining how to secure our ropes for the next section, a steep climb that required more skill than I possessed. I tried to listen, but my attention kept drifting to her. She was checking her gear with a practiced ease, her fingers moving over the ropes and carabiners like they were extensions of her hands. I noticed a scar on her wrist, thin and pale, snaking beneath the cuff of her sleeve. It looked old but deep, like a memory etched into her skin. I couldn't stop myself. "That from climbing?" I asked, pointing to the scar. She paused, her fingers stilling on her rope, and looked at me with eyes that held a storm of emotions. "Yeah," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the wind. 3 years ago, things went wrong." Her words were clipped, but the pain in them was raw, like a wound that hadn't healed. I wanted to ask more, to know what had happened, but the weight of her gaze stopped me, and I just nodded, feeling the ache of her loss in my own chest. We started climbing again, the group moving in a slow, careful rhythm. I focused on the rope in my hands, the rough texture grounding me as I pulled myself up the rocky face. But my mind kept circling back to her, to the way her voice had cracked, to the scar that told a story she wasn't ready to share. I felt a pull toward her, not just curiosity, but something deeper, like we were tethered by the same kind of grief. My own guilt over the divorce, over the years I'd lost trying to be someone I wasn't, felt like a shadow next to hers, but it was enough to make me feel connected to her in a way I hadn't expected. At the next rest stop, I sat closer to her, our knees almost touching as we shared a flat rock. The silence between us was different now, less guarded, like we'd crossed some invisible line. I could smell the faint scent of her, sweat and pine and something earthy that made my pulse quicken. She offered me a sip from her flask, her fingers brushing mine as she passed it. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I wondered if she felt it too. I took a sip, the water cool against my lips, and handed it back, our eyes meeting for a moment that felt too long. The climb continued, and I found myself matching my pace to hers, even though she stayed at the back. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, catching her eye or the curve of her shoulder as she moved. There was a grace to her, a quiet strength that made me want to be stronger too. I didn't know what was happening between us, but it was real, a thread pulling tighter with every step. The mountains were stripping me bare, exposing parts of me I buried, and her presence was making it impossible to hide from them. By the time we stopped for the evening, my body was exhausted, but my mind was alive with thoughts of her. We sat by the fire again, closer this time, our shoulders brushing as we passed a shared thermos of tea. The touch was accidental, but neither of us moved away, and I felt the warmth of her arm against mine like a promise. I didn't know her story, not fully, but I knew she was carrying something heavy, just like me. And in that moment, I realized I wanted to help her carry it, even if I didn't know how. The stars were brighter up here, sharp against the black sky, and I felt small, but not alone. Her presence was a quiet anchor, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what this was, this pull, this heat, but it was growing, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. The mountains were teaching me to feel again, and she was part of that lesson, her silence and her scars drawing me closer. I glanced at her, her face softened by the firelight, and my heart stuttered. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was waking up. The final push to the summit began at dawn, the sky a pale bruise above the jagged peaks. My body ached from days of climbing, each muscle screaming with the effort, but I pressed on, driven by something deeper than exhaustion. The air was so thin now that every breath felt like sipping through a straw, sharp and insufficient. I focused on the rhythm of my steps, the crunch of gravel under my boots, trying to anchor myself against the dizziness creeping in. This was it, the moment I'd been chasing since I signed up for this climb, the chance to stand at the top and feel something real. But as I climbed, I knew it wasn't just about the view anymore. The trail narrowed to a treacherous ridge, the drop on one side a stark reminder of how far we'd come. I gripped my rope tightly, my palms sweaty despite the cold, and stole glances at her behind me. She moved with a quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the path with a focus that made her seem part of the mountain itself. Her presence was a steady pulse in the chaos of my thoughts, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this struggle. I wondered if she felt the same pull I did, the same unspoken connection that had grown stronger with every step. We reached the summit just as the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the peaks in a golden light that stole my breath. I stood there, my chest heaving, staring out at the endless expanse of mountains stretching into the distance. The world felt vast and silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel both insignificant and alive. My eyes stung, not from the wind, but from the weight of reaching this place, of proving to myself that I could still do something that mattered. I'd come here to escape, but standing on that summit, I felt like I'd found something instead. She was a few steps away, her gaze not on the view but on the ground below, where the trail disappeared into shadow. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched at her sides, and I knew this place held memories for her, memories that weren't kind. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between us, but I hesitated, unsure of my place in her story. Then she turned, and her eyes met mine, raw and unguarded, like she was letting me see the pain she'd been carrying. It was a moment of such naked vulnerability that my heart stuttered. "I thought I'd never come back here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, rough with emotion. "Not after what happened." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of loss, and I felt them settle into my chest like stones. I stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of her breath in the cold air, and before I could think, she closed the distance. Her lips found mine, soft but urgent, and the world fell away. The mountains, the wind, the ache in my bones. There was only her, the taste of her, the heat of her hands cupping my face. The kiss was everything. Fierce, desperate, alive. I pressed myself closer, my fingers tangling in her jacket, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against mine. The thin air made my head spin, but her touch grounded me, her lips a lifeline in the vastness of the summit. I could taste the salt of her skin, the faint bitterness of the mountain air, and it was intoxicating, like I was drinking in her pain and her strength all at once. I didn't know how long we stood there, lost in each other, but it felt like forever and not long enough. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths came in ragged gasps, the cold air sharp in our lungs. Her eyes were bright, glistening with something that might have been tears, and she smiled, a small, fragile thing that made my chest ache. I wanted to say something, to tell her what this moment meant, but my throat was tight, and words felt too small for what I was feeling. She reached out, her fingers brushing my cheek, and the tenderness in her touch was enough to make me forget the cold, the altitude, everything but her. We stood there for a moment longer, the silence between us filled with a new kind of understanding. The summit stretched out around us, vast and unyielding, but it was her presence that made it feel like home. I didn't know what had happened here 3 years ago, but I knew it had changed her, and now it was changing me. This wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about finding her, about finding myself in the space between us. I took her hand, her fingers warm against mine, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. The guide called us back, her voice distant and unimportant. We turned to face the group, but I could still feel the ghost of her lips on mine, the echo of her touch in my skin. The mountains had given me what I'd come for, not a view, but a moment, a connection that burned brighter than the sun on the peaks. I glanced at her, and she met my gaze, her eyes steady and sure. Whatever came next, I knew we'd face it together. The descent began under a sky heavy with clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. My legs trembled as I navigated the steep, rocky trail, each step a test of balance and will. The summit's euphoria still lingered, but the reality of the climb back down grounded me, reminding me of the fragility of what we'd found up there. My body was exhausted, yet my mind buzzed with the memory of her lips, her hands, the way her breath had mingled with mine in the thin air. I glanced back at her, trailing at the end of the group as always, her face unreadable, but her eyes catching mine with a quiet intensity. This wasn't over. Not the climb, not us. The path was treacherous, slick with loose gravel that shifted underfoot. I focused on my footing, but my thoughts kept drifting to her, to the moment on the summit that had changed everything. The kiss had been a spark, igniting something I hadn't known I could still feel. But now, descending, I wondered what it meant. Was it a fleeting thing, born of the altitude and isolation, or something more? My divorce had taught me to doubt my instincts, to question anything that felt too good. But her presence behind me was a steady pull, urging me to trust again. We stopped at a small outcrop to rest, the group huddling against the wind. I sat on a flat stone, my breath visible in the cold air, and she settled beside me, closer than before. Her shoulder brushed mine, a deliberate touch that sent warmth spreading through me despite the chill. I wanted to reach for her hand, to feel the reassurance of her fingers, but I hesitated, unsure of the boundaries we'd yet to define. She looked at me, her eyes soft but searching, and I felt exposed, like she could see the questions I was too afraid to ask. Without a word, she passed me her flask, her fingers lingering against mine, and the contact was enough to steady me. As we continued down, the trail grew steeper, forcing us to move with care. I could hear her steps behind me, measured and sure, a rhythm that synced with my own. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the memory of the summit, with the unspoken promise of something new. I thought about my old life, the endless meetings, the lonely nights, the weight of a marriage that had crumbled under its own lies. Down here, those things felt like shadows, fading in the light of what I'd found with her. I didn't know where this was going, but I wanted to find out. At the next rest stop, we sat together again, our knees touching as we shared a packet of dried fruit. The group was quieter now, the descent sapping our energy, but the space between us felt alive. She spoke then, her voice low, telling me about the accident 3 years ago, her partner, the rope that failed, the guilt that had followed her like a ghost. Her words were raw, each one a piece of herself she was offering me. I listened, my heart aching for her. And when she paused, I told her about my divorce, about the years I'd spent trying to be someone I wasn't. It was the first time I'd said it out loud, and it felt like shedding a skin. The trail wound on, the mountains looming around us like silent witnesses. I felt her presence beside me, her arm brushing mine as we navigated a narrow pass, and it was enough to keep me grounded. The descent was harder than the climb, not just because of the terrain, but because it meant returning to the world below, to the uncertainties we'd left behind. But her touch, her gaze, made me believe we could carry this connection with us, that it wasn't just a moment confined to the summit. I wanted to hold on to it, to her, even as the path pulled us downward. By evening, we reached a lower camp, the air thicker and easier to breathe. We sat by the fire, our shoulders pressed together, and I felt the weight of her story settle into me, mingling with my own. Her hand found mine, her fingers weaving through my own, and the simple act felt like a vow. We didn't speak, but we didn't need to. The warmth of her skin, the steady rhythm of her breathing said enough. I looked at her, the firelight dancing across her face, and saw not just the pain she carried, but the strength, the possibility of something new. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The mountains had changed me, stripped away the layers of doubt and guilt I'd carried for so long. But it was her silence, her scars, her touch that made me feel alive again. As we sat there, hand in hand, I realized this wasn't just about forgiving myself for the past. It was about daring to want more, to believe I deserved it. The descent was leading us back to the world, but it was also leading us to each other, and I knew I'd carry that with me long after the mountains were behind us. When we finally reached the base the next day, the group dispersed, voices loud with relief and exhaustion. I stood by the bus, my pack heavy on my shoulders, and she came to stand beside me. Her hand brushed mine, a quiet question, and I answered by lacing my fingers with hers. The mountains had been my escape, but they'd given me something more, a beginning, a chance to start again. I looked at her, her eyes steady and warm, and smiled. Whatever lay ahead, we'd face it together.